Talk about a Norwegian in a family and where it fits in the literary pantheon.
Well, that is, as far as I know, it's about, I think it's 2,460 something, 65,000 words or thereabout. And as far as I know, it's the longest real novel that anyone's ever written. Now, I say that because there are novels that, what I would consider gimmick novels, where people have typed just one word over and over again. Or there are writers like Henry Darger, who wrote a 9 million word piece of shit manuscript. He was this mentally ill man that when he died, they found his manuscript, and it's bad writing with bad art and all this kind of stuff. But mine is, as far as I know, the longest book that was written in just one period. It took 17 months. Um, War and Peace, which is actually a little shorter than the Vincetti brothers at about 600,000 words. That took, I think, Tolstoy 12, 15 years to write, something like that. It took me 9 months to write Vincetti brothers and 17 months to write A Norwegian in the Family. Now, I did take a lot of snippets from public domain works, and one of the reasons I did that was because I was really getting I really don't like the way the public domain and copyright system in the U.S. or the world is currently set up. And I mentioned that earlier, how I had the character of Bit von Rheingold going in and out of tales, and it's an acid trip, so he sometimes redoes the same scenes, but each time he goes through the scene, there's always a difference. Sometimes it's a large difference, a noticeable difference. Other times it might just be the change of one or two words that changes slightly the context of it. Um, I also, as I'd done in earlier books and did a little bit more in Vincetti Brothers, in A Norwegian in the Family, I took real life human beings, celebrities, and littered them throughout the book. Um, there's Woody Allen has an early appearance playing with one of his band, playing his clarinet in a band. I had the guy who founded the father of modern bodybuilding, Joe Weider, and his real life wife, a former pinup girl, appear in it. I have well known mobsters appear, real life mobsters appear in the book from some of the New York mafia families. Howard Hughes appears in the book. Probably the most well developed real character is Andy Warhol, the painter, who becomes a friend of Bit von Rheingold, the dwarf pornographer, and Big Frank Concetto, the would-be mobster boss. Um, and there are a lot. Howard Hughes, as I mentioned, he's sort of a James Bondian, almost like supervillain. George Bush, or not George Bush, George Bush's, the first president, George Bush's father, appears in in this as the head of a fictional uh, defense organization or intelligence agency. So it's a way to lend period credence to things. Jim Morrison from The Doors appears in the book, and I probably have 50 or 60 or more real life people. Many that are still known, others that are forgotten. Uh, but the basic thrust of the book, it's in four major books within the book. It follows the rise and fall of uh, the mobster Paulie Maravelli, how he was betrayed by Big Frank Concetto, which is only hinted at in the Vincetti brothers. It follows the character of the Norwegian, who is this sort of white knight or wannabe white knight crusading, mass murdering hitman. Uh, but as the book evolved, it took on its own form, and it became a record of the times. Some of my favorite scenes are things that have nothing to do with the crime element or even the celebrity element. I have a nice long passage about sneakers that are thrown up on top of wires, which a lot of the big East Coast cities in the mid 20th century, this was a hallmark. You could go down, even when I was a kid in the early 70s, you could go down a street and you would see the telephone wires or the electrical cables, and you would see 3 or 4 dozen pairs of sneakers tied together and tossed up. And I don't know, do they still do that? Do you still see that sometimes? Yeah,
They still do it. I remembered it a lot in the mid to late '90s. Now, it's less common, but
yeah,
you still see it around.
yeah. And that's a good example of a scene that I'm sure a lot of people who write novels today probably could not only could not write, but would not want to write because it 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 gives a much more subtle into the character uh, and character development. There's one of the things in most of my writing, I don't over describe things. I don't over describe characters. I give some generalities, like I'll mention Bit von Rheingold as a dwarf. I'll give the approximate size and weight of Big Frankenchetto, but I don't go into a lot of the description because and the same thing with neighborhoods or whatnot, because that's not as important as what happens. Because if I spent all the time over describing, the, the the big Frankenchetto that you would envision would still be different than the next reader. So most of that doesn't serve a purpose, and most of it is done so badly. There was a week or so ago on I was listening to NPR as I was driving around on my new job at night, and there was some bad writer who wrote a book called City on Fire, and I heard passages from it. Such over description. Just describing something in detail is not good writing. Over modification of verbs and nouns rather than developing characters and getting an interior description. One of the phrases I always use is it's more important to know what is seen, to look from behind a character's eyes, and to know what the color of the character's eyes are. Don't describe the physical characteristics so much as describe what is important to that character. And if you do that, what that character notices, you can slip in behind those eyes and identify and empathize with that character. And that's one of the things that the total immersive quality of the scenes that I play out in the big books like Vincetti Brothers and a Norwegian the family do better than I've ever seen in any other book. It puts you behind the characters so that when 500 or 600 or 800 or 1,000 pages have gone by and a character that has disappeared in chapter 12 reappears in chapter 37, you'll remember that character. You'll remember it as if that character was alive, and and you'll say, "Oh, Billy Joe is back in the book. I remember him or her or whatever from earlier." Although there's no Billy Joe in Norwegian, but uh, it's the kind of book too that I know is going to eventually probably spawn a cottage industry just on that one book. Forget the whole quartet. That one book, A Norwegian the Family, you could write 100 books about it, and I'm sure over the years and decades and centuries from now, there will be lots of people that will just be jizzing over that book because I as James Joyce wrote a lot of his books with the specific intent of having a lot of exegesis brought to it. So do I. The difference is I'm just not playing a lot of these kind of bullshit games that the Joyces and a lot of these postmodernists, even worse writers, do. There's meat and there's substance there, and it's got the wisdom and the knowledge that people can use, and that's why people go to art. So that's basically, uh, I guess, a précis of that book.